Bueno, buenas tardes a todos. Gracias por estar aquí. Hoy tenemos un seminario con Fabrizio Esposito. Él es profesor asistente en la Nova School of Law en Portugal. Tiene un doctorado en la European University Institute en el año 2018 y sus temas de interés tienen que ver evidentemente con el análisis económico del derecho, pero en particular con el derecho de consumo, la protección de datos, el derecho de la libre competencia y también se interesa por los desafíos que plantean las nuevas tecnologías en materia de regulación jurídica. Hoy nos va a hablar de un libro que publicó recientemente y que es derivado de su trabajo en la tesis doctoral, que tiene que ver con la hipótesis del bienestar del consumidor en Law and Economics. El título es el que da el nombre al seminario, The Consumer Welfare Hypothesis in Law and Economics. Muchas gracias, Fabricio, por estar aquí en este inicio de año para la red de filosofía del derecho privado. Ya te había comentado más o menos el formato usual, es una media hora de presentación, media hora, 40 minutos de presentación y luego abrimos a debate. Aviso a los asistentes que Fabrizio hemos acordado al final, por la manera en que se publicitó, que dé su charla en inglés. Pero entiende perfectamente castellano y el portugués lo habla con mucha fluidez, así que las preguntas pueden ser en cualquier lengua. Si hubiera algún problema de comprensión, ya nos lo hace saber y entre todos traducimos. Nada, es tu tiempo, Fabricio. Nuevamente, muchas gracias por la disposición a presentar estas ideas aquí en este foro.
Grazie, Diego. Muito obrigados e bem-vindos. Buongiorno, buon pomeriggio e buonasera, forse. Yes, so I am actually quite excited to be here because this is the first time that I get to present this project after it being finished to a community of legal theorists and also a community of people that does not has an interest but does not have a direct stake in the terms of this debate. And as May came out, one of the things that I've been learning after the book was published is that to a very large, it is quite significant, and I had been underestimating the power dimensions of that are related to a project like this. But we will get there eventually. So I guess that, so before I forget, the book also has a Twitter account where many of the issues that are discussed here are summarized in 280 characters or a little bit more. And that is the account. You can see it. You can see it here. Do you see my mouse when I move it? Okay. Now, first of all, what is the consumer welfare hypothesis? It is jurisdiction specific. Okay, it is about EU law for the moment, and the claim in and I'm gonna read it because here every word matters, right? So I expect to have every word really matters here. The EU legal order is better understood as meant to allocate resources efficiently. Okay, this is the main part of the claim. When one uses the consumer welfare standard rather than the total welfare one. This is the consumer welfare hypothesis. So embedded in this claim, there is a ambiguity, right? So all of this builds on the idea that there is an ambiguity in the notion of allocative efficiency. And as you can imagine, this is quite foundational as a doubt to raise, considering that we are normally taught that when it comes to the welfare standard to be used, law and economics people essentially speak with one and one voice only, and that voice is total welfare. Okay, so everything I'm going to ask you to enter into a state of malleability of your beliefs, because essentially everything you know, you have been taught about what law and economics is about and how it relates with everything else that we know about, especially private law, I would say, in this context, is perhaps to be reevaluated on the basis of the claim that there is actually an ambiguity that we have not been told. So what I want to talk about is first just a quick overview, and I want to jump immediately into the discussion of the aims of the book, why I think that this is an important project at different levels. And then I want to discuss about the methods that I use to build the claim, right? And then there is a discussion also about the future, because if this were a movie, or if this were a part of a movie, this would be the part of the movie where the leader of the Magnificent Seven, or the leader of the Seven Samurais, goes from village to village searching for allies. Okay, so that is the part of the story. So the reason why I think that it is really important to work on the methodological foundations and conceptual foundations of the economic approach to private law in particular, is because when people get it right, and I think this book from Siciliani, Riefe, and Gamper is an excellent example of that, when people get it right from a conceptual and methodological perspective, it is really useful. It is really useful to build narratives that I think can be quite impactful in order to tell to a legislator, a judge, or a regulator that there is a need for more intervention, right, in a certain context. Because you bring it all to coherence into a framework that connects with things that they already know, and so on. And it also brings quite an important degree of clarity and analytical capacity in reflecting how the law relates with certain market situations. Of course, then it needs to get even more. This is not conclusive, right? Because in order to inform policy, also empirical evidence is important. But what I have learned, and I would talk about this towards the end, with a book project on price personalization, is that, and special empiricists working in this area have confirmed, it is often the case that people don't get to ask the right empirical questions by designing the experiments that we need in order to ask the relevant policy questions by themselves. We need to tell them what we need to know in order to decide the kind of policy that we need. So all of this is part of a broader machinery where we make sure that the law works in the way that it is intended to be, as decided by legitimate institutions. Okay. Now, if this is the aspiration, this is the reality. So the reality is that until a couple of years ago, you only had the column on the left and the small dot in the center. The big change in recent years is that now you have a column on the right. The column on the right being law and political economy, which is a group of scholars that, even though they call themselves law and political economy, this is their banner, they want to do without economics. And they want to do without economics, essentially, in my understanding, because they are extremely irritated by efficiency language, not because of efficiency, not for aesthetical reasons, but because they quintessentially associate efficiency language to a neoliberal project of which they have seen the damages in their society and in the legal doctrines that they study. And I will not deny that this is the case. I will not, I can only speak for the doctrines that I know about, more specifically in Europe. And personally, I think that in Europe, it is, the situation is, the evidence is more mixed. But from what I know about US antitrust law, there is reason to be enraged. Now, on the left, instead, you have the incumbent law and economics people with sometimes their inflammatory language, you know, efficient rape, selling babies, fairness versus welfare, everything that is not efficient makes no sense, kind of thing that you find also in fairness versus welfare, although that was a book that in many respects was well-meaning, but not enough. Now, in the middle, you have this small dot, and this dot, if this dot were to be spatially representative, it would even be smaller than what it currently is. Probably the column on the left would be larger. But in the middle, I think there is the methodological position that we need to defend, and it is not currently defended enough. And the methodological position I associated with the work of the economist on the left, Warren Samuels, who is one of the great institutional economists of the Michigan Lake School of Institutional Economics, Samuels, Schmidt, Miller, I think Miller was also the name. Anyway, is on the right side, probably somebody that it is easier to recognize for this crowd, namely Guido Calabresi. What I develop in the first part of the book, after a pars destruens, is the idea that by putting their different perspectives on this matter together, you get a fuller picture. And in this fuller picture, it is really the case that the first task for theory building at the intersection between law and economics is accepting that economics is a discipline where you have disagreement, sifting through this disagreement in order to identify the version of a theory or a model or a conception of a concept that makes better sense of the legal structures that you have, right? A purely descriptive task of concept matching, right? Actually, terminological matching, because the concept is the concept dependently of the language that is being used to express it. But this is the challenge that we have, right? It is often very difficult to see that somebody speaking in terms of fairness might be saying the same thing of somebody speaking in terms of efficiency. But this is what I found in the book, and I will get there more in detail. But this is, I think, the way forward, and we desperately need more clarity, because one of the things that I document in the book is that when you don't have conceptual clarity and you have unnecessary terminological complexity, what you have is policy debates that are unnecessarily complex. They allow for trench warfare, right? It also, at some point, it becomes identitarian. I am the guy that defends a certain theory of contract and da-da-da. And we actually spend so many hours of highly trained thinkers on ideas that are meant not to succeed. And this ends up being actually an obstacle to policy, right? It weakens the institutions. For example, antitrust is an area where you can see this quite clearly. There is a tendency to say, oh, there are so many goals, it is so complex that we should tear it down and start building it from scratch. If you do something like that, it is the power groups that are better organized that are going to eventually benefit from that. Now, this is a defensive slide, so bear with me. The defensive slide is the idea that I'm not making sorry, let the record show that there is a mess in the slide, because the title of the columns does not. I see Edgar, who is looking carefully to try to figure it out. Yes, there is a mess with the slides. I think I deleted the wrong one. And okay, so what I want to say now, I'm gonna go back here, is that one of the problems that we have is efficiency versus fairness. This book here, so this kind of language, efficiency instead of justice. And the single piece of evidence that I would like to bring to this audience today is that either independently of whether it is total welfare or whether it is consumer welfare, in both cases, both notions of efficiency rely on a defensible notion of equality, okay? And in case of total welfare, personally, I disagree with it, but then the minute in which we accept it as such, the efficiency versus language is something that we already managed to leave behind. And that is already something. And the only thing that you need to do is reading economic textbooks carefully, because what they tell you is, why is monopoly worse than perfect competition? This is the pragmatic test that economists use to explain why perfect competition is so good, right? And why it is important to fix the market when it fails. And they say, well, monopoly has two effects. One is that it redistributes resources to the powerful from the less powerful. And the other one is that you do not have as many transactions as you could, right? So this is the triangle part of the story. The official story is, this is really bad. But at the same time, the same story in its full version says, well, the triangle is bad, but I, the state, I, the analyst, owe equal respect to both the consumer and the producer. This means that I am not entitled to say that the consumer is more entitled to that amount of money in comparison to the producer. So whether the consumer pays it 5 or pays it 7, I cannot say that I prefer the consumer to the producer. That would be violating my duty of neutrality. But what I can say is that by charging 7, there is some consumer who is not going to get it. And this consumer is represented by the triangle. And in that sense, while being neutral between consumers and producers, I can still say monopoly is bad. Now, this is one version of equality. The other version of equality, which I have been exploring in the book and also in other research also, we can get there towards the end. It's part of the research that I'm quite excited about. But the point is, me and you, we are equal because in a role-based sense. When I am the consumer, I am the sovereign. And when you and in the same interaction, you are the subject. So there is a hierarchical relationship between the two of us on the market. But why would you want to accept that? Because of an equality principle. Because when you are consumer, I am your subject and you are my sovereign. And that's why on the cover here you have the crown versus the triangle, right? And the scale is because the law is in favor of this idea, and economists should start paying attention to this fact. Now, so what I'm not saying in this project is that real markets left to their own devices would deliver this sovereignty to consumers. This is an empirical claim, okay? And it is very easy to move from this normative level to the fact, oh, we don't need to intervene. And that, in my view, this is essentially one of the two central tenets of neoliberalism. So I'm not endorsing that. Another thing that I'm not endorsing, and that might make people nervous, is I'm not saying that let's pollute all the oceans as long as consumers on the market get a little bit better off. This is not the story. The story is in the relationship between the consumer and the trader on the market. It is their contract that is our unit of analysis. So if their contract generates negative externality for the environment, it is a problem that needs to be addressed. It is not irrelevant. The consumer, the sovereign consumer, has also duties toward the rest of towards the environment. Okay. Now, what about the hard question? The hard question is, what happens in situations where workers are being exploited and consumers benefit from that? Consumers are not entitled to the exploitation of workers, because also those workers are consumers in another market, right? They're very hard. So it is a different kind of relationship that you need to analyze, a different contractual relationship that between the worker and its employer, and make sure that that relationship is fair, right? And then you can move in parallel or in alternative to the consumer contract and analyze that. So these are things, these are connected but separable units of analysis. And all things considered, judgment needs to take care of all these things, but the problems can also be separated. One of the things that this provides is I think, a fresh perspective on the point of contractual of exchange contracts, and the idea that the most interesting framework for the analysis of exchange contracts that economists came up with is that of principal agent theory. Why? Because in principal agent theory, you maximize the interest of the principal by smart contractual design. And then, so there is a lot of insights that you can derive from the findings of principal agent theory, because the only thing that you need to posit is that the principal is the consumer. And we, at least under this framework that I am working with, we have reason to make that application. And I also find quite convenient, no, that it is fine to say that the firm has the task of maximizing interest for the shareholder. Like, no one fundamentally disagrees with this idea, especially among the people that say that the market has to do with total welfare. And I find it a little bit self-serving that you say, oh, the firm has to maximize the interest of the shareholders, but the market has to maximize the interest of everyone. How about we say, okay, so if we allow for agent-based maximization in the firm, then perhaps we should consider carefully the idea that agent-based maximization makes also sense in the market. So in this context, the point is that consumer welfare maximization is the internal institutional value. I would even, after reading Joseph Heath on business ethics, if you're not familiar with his work, it's amazing. I am confident in saying it's the immanent value. So this theory claims the immanent value of market exchanges is the maximization of the welfare of the consumers on that market. Now, why is it so difficult to find this account mainstream? I think that there are three reasons. The first is zombies and necromancers. It is more developed in the book, but one of the most amazing findings, and I always thank Damiano Canale for his advice on this matter, is going directly to the economists that matter. What did Adam Smith say? What the Kaldor of Kaldoric's efficiency say? What did Hicks of Kaldoric's efficiency say? So I went through a list of economists whose work is normally associated with the law and economics literature, right? So Pareto, Kaldor, Hicks, Smith, Frank Knight, Stigler, Coase, of course. The only one who is a clear total welfarist by the economic textbook is Stigler. Guess what? He's one of the economists who contributed to writing the textbooks and the generations of scholars who have been using those textbooks. But Adam Smith has the boldest quotation in favor of the consumer welfare standard ever. He even goes as far as saying that the maxim is so perfectly self-evident that attempting to prove it is absurd, right? How comes that Smith is normally waived as a defendant of self-interest as a means to maximize total welfare? Well, one of the reasons why is that, again, Stigler, when he published an abridged, shortened version of The Wealth of the Nations, he conveniently chopped off the parts where it was about the consumers, right? So that's why there are zombies, because there are people that are constantly being waived, summoned, used. Dead people, unfortunately, who cannot defend themselves in support of ideas they did not support. And there are people who do this quite well. And in parallel, there is a problem of reification, because the minute we assume that efficiency is in conflict with equality, for example, we have already included a layer of complexity in our language and in our analysis that we need to carry over until the end of the analysis. But I just discussed that even if you don't believe in the idea that it is plausible to think that efficiency is about consumer welfare, the economic textbooks propose an idea of equality in support of their idea of efficiency, right? And then, in parallel to these, there is also, of course, the disciplinary identitarian matter that who are you to come and telling me how I should analyze my own things, right? So I believe that because of the conceptual complexity, because of the identitarian element, because of the structures of powers that benefit from this state of the art, the state of the art is the one that it is unnecessary, where the situation is unnecessarily complicated. And now the only hard question for this audience. Because I would believe, I have grown up believing that the legal theorist is that privileged person who gets paid to ask the very complicated questions that no one else has the patience or the skills to work on, and then bring the benefits of that analysis to the rest of the legal community. So I would say that it is a specific professional duty of legal theorists to help local legal communities coming out of the dump. If you think about it, Dworkin and Coleman tried really hard to do that, right? And to be honest, I think that its wealth of value is, although it is really difficult the way it is written, it is still advancing a conceptual challenge to the law and economics approach that I believe I am capable to grasp with, to grapple with, because I really care about the content of legal reasoning, which has been constantly dismissed in the field. Diego, how much time do I have left?
Entre 15 y 20 minutos.
Ah.
No, 15 minutos. 15
okay. Maximum. So we have all read Weinrib, I believe. We have read Tamanaha. This is the EU private law version of the same idea, okay? And in EU private law, the idea, I would say, is also particularly powerful, because if you say, oh, we protect consumers, we want to protect the consumers, either to ensure their freedom or the weaker party protection. Okay, you can slice it both ways. Suppose it's the same idea. Now, you create an internal market. Why do you create an internal market? Well, you create an internal market. What is the value that justifies creating an internal market? Economists tells us is the maximization of total welfare, right? So if you create an internal market to maximize total welfare, then when you say, I want to protect consumers, you do not want to protect consumers as an end in itself. You want to protect, you want to instrumentalize the interest of consumers and the protection of consumers to a collective goal, the collective goal being the maximization of total welfare. Bam, you get the instrumentalization critique in its most powerful formulation, I think. Now, if the internal market, if the market mechanism is justified because it fosters the consumer interest, then the situation is different. Because if you have national legislation that fosters the consumer interest, and then you harmonize it so that you have a stronger market, and all of this is going to benefit the consumers, you are not instrumentalizing anything. You are taking into consideration a different factual context, and you are creating a different institutional context so that that initial goal that you were trying to foster at the national level in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Portugal, and so on, now you are giving to the consumers the benefit of a way larger market. And the expectation is that they will benefit from that. Now, this can be wrong, okay? Consumers can be harmed. The plan may not work, but you cannot, it is unfair as a matter of epistemic justice under this account of allocative efficiency to say that the interest of consumers is being instrumentalized. You may disagree with the institutional choices that are being made, but as means to ends, the problem is not with the ends, and it makes a complete difference in my opinion. Now, if you happen to engage with some law and economics people, here is some things that you can tell them. So first of all, they can tell you, oh, this norm should be changed because it reduces total welfare. And then you can reply, oh, that's very interesting, but I know that from an economic point of view, these norms make sense in terms of consumer welfare. So your claim is legally irrelevant. Goodbye. Or you can even tell them, you know what? If efficiency is about consumer welfare, actually, the legislation that you're criticizing is efficient. So now you have a problem on the basis of your own conceptual framework, not on the basis of mine. And I think, to be honest, I think this is sublime, right? I accept everything, I even, I have a slide on that got moved somewhere. Here it is. You accept almost everything up to a point that people in this field are not accepting anymore, right? Most people now do not accept value monism. It's like efficiency, but you need to balance it with something else and da-da-da. No, I am going full efficient here. I am trying to redescribe the system only in efficiency terms. And guess what? It makes sense. That's the point. If it is about consumer welfare, the system makes sense, and it vindicates Posner's initial value proposition to the legal community, which was a valid one, I think. It was the promise of helping with a non-legal framework to clarify the structure of the legal system, which, of course, if you come from common law and you are being bombarded every week by cases over cases over cases over cases, and you struggle to see the coherence, it is particularly valuable. It is less valuable for us civil lawyers, but it is still valuable, right? There is a fascinating theoretical commitment behind this project. And I accept all of that. On top of everything, what I do is introducing a focus on the reasoning. It is the reasoning that matters. It is not the outcomes. You can build whatever model under whatever convenient assumptions and conclude whatever you want. Still, it doesn't matter because I am in the business of analyzing the reasons that are given in legal practice to justify the exercise of legal authority. That's my job. I hope it's also yours. Right? So, and here is the challenge. So sometimes legal reasoning is very superficial. Sometimes the court simply says traders are normally free to set prices. And then there isn't much theoretical explanatory work that you can do with a statement like this. But then you have a case like the Mars case, for example, in EU internal market law. And in market, you see, traders are normally free to set their prices because consumers benefit from price competition. Right? It's not society as a whole. It is those people who are on those markets. And this is not simply a generic statement. It is a statement that it is then used to analyze whether a specific legislation that was introduced by a member state, the second part of the sentence, should be considered compatible with EU law or not. And the Court of Justice finds that it is. Okay, so you can do quite a lot of interesting conceptual work. And personally, so what I did is I did this. Chapter 4 of the book discusses the theoretical framework, which is inspired and strongly influenced by the work of Canal and Touzé on legal inferentialism. But in a way, I twist it on its head. I'm not interested in the commitments and entitlements that parties explicitly give to each other, but I am interested in analyzing legal reasoning as a way to give entitlements to the theories. Right? The theories come to the legal reasoning with commitments. And these commitments is expressed in the form of answers to these questions. Why is the law concerned with market participants being harmed? The total welfare answer is, well, we are concerned to the extent and contingently, insofar as by harming consumers or competitors or the environment or whatever, we reduce total welfare. But if it is about consumer welfare, I am going to be concerned about harming competitors only to the extent that by harming competitors, I have a legitimate, a reasonable belief that consumers are going to be harmed. Whereas I'm always concerned if consumers are harmed, of course, right? And so my favorite one is the one about defenses and exceptions, because I think that there is where courts need to rely on a reason in order to defeat the plain meaning of a provision, right? And that is always a costly choice to make from an institutional point of view, because essentially you are disrespecting the expectations that people have formed by reading the plain meaning of that provision, right? The plain meaning told me that I could do it, but a more careful analysis, teleologically justified, of the provision tells me that I couldn't do it. So my expectations are disappointed. Right? So I think that it is when these kind of things happen, is that you get the better, the more reliable evidence. But for the purposes of my own analysis, what I did is I divided about 150 court decisions from EU consumer law. For the legislations that I took in consumer law, this was actually the entire population. And I have theoretical justifications for why these pieces of EU consumer law are particularly important. Okay. And what I found is that I divide them into two big families of interventions: empowerment and protection. And then I analyze the legal materials under all these different theoretical disagreements. And what do the H and the N mean? This is the scorekeeping in the legal inferentialist sense. I give 3 types of scores: high quality explanations, acceptable explanations, and unacceptable or no explanation. So what I do, and this is one of the theoretical positions that you may want to challenge, What happens if in the same population of cases, I have a lot of superficial statements that you can explain in one way or another, because essentially they do not go deep enough. So if you say free price setting is good, and that's it, then I can say, well, free price setting is good because price competition benefits the consumers. It is an acceptable account of what the court has written. But equally good is the account where I say it is good because competition maximizes total welfare, right? So these are both acceptable explanations. So I think it is theoretically relevant when the explanans matches very closely what the court said, like in the second part of Marx. That is, in my opinion, a high quality explanation. And how high quality explanations should trump an merely acceptable explanations. The real difficult situation is where you have both in the same part of the data set. And in that case, essentially what I did was I was willing to put them in the middle, right? You have two strong forces in the two opposite directions. It means that there is a problem in the case law that requires further investigation. In antitrust, this is relevant in one instance. In consumer law, this was not relevant. Now, in last part, what can we do with all of this? First of all, on top of simply replying argumentatively to people in those sense, a very interesting application is the debate on price personalization, right? We see the similar. I found here patterns that I found elsewhere. It is really complex. We do not have enough empirical evidence. And the normative complexity is paralyzing. You read the authors of some papers, and they only manage to rely on the plain meaning of the provisions that they are examining, because there is a normative framework that talks about freedom, and another one that talks about exploitation, and another one that talks about efficiency, and it is not clear the direction how they fit with each other, so they refrain from entering the normative debate. If all of this is about consumer welfare, then you say, true, sometimes price personalization stimulates competition. If Esteban is fond of Apple computers and Alexander is fond of Microsoft computers, there is a discount that it might make sense to offer Esteban to convince him to switch from Apple to Microsoft. And the same goes for Alexander with regard to Apple computers, right? This stimulates competition, and we need to identify the people in order to be able to make this kind of moves. So I'm not denying, sometimes price personalization can be beneficial to the consumer, and it might even be that charging a higher price to Edgar in comparison to Henry might be justifiable. Why? Because if you go to Edgar and you say, Edgar, look, on the basis of we normally ask, I don't know, 10 euros per month of contribution to our charity. But on the basis of the data that we have available about you, we think that a similar sacrifice would be 15. Are you willing to offer 15? Or would you prefer to stay with the 10? I mean, there is some persuasion that is going on here, but you are free to choose one or the other. And I think I'm treating you with enough respect. So the empirical complexity remains, but from a normative point of view, it is way easier to talk about price personalization. And I am editing with a friend the Cambridge Handbook on algorithmic price personalization and the law. And inside the book, we have seen these dances going on. There is a chapter where in the draft that we received, the author says, well, the Court of Justice did say that EU competition law is about consumer law, is about consumer welfare. However, it said it in a context where normally it would not make a difference in terms of outcomes if it was about consumer welfare or total welfare. So we wait the court to say, in a situation like this, where it does make a difference, whether it's about consumer welfare or total welfare. For the reasons that I mentioned before, this is the position that makes no sense, because you need to take into consideration the reasons that are given, not the fact that in most of the situations the outcome would be the same. Also because there are actually cases in the case law where the outcome would be different, as I document in the book. So, of course, there is an ideology that certain people have been trained into that exercises an inertia in their system of belief. But this is exactly the kind of things that I think legal theorists should be engaging with. So what next if I made a decent case? First of all, you can use it in this way, right? To debunk the terms of an ongoing debate. Second, you can replicate it, right? So this is a claim that I did about EU law. What about Argentinian law? Or what about Spanish law? Or can we build a comparative law framework within the law and economics tradition where interesting things are happening, and use in the context of that framework this idea, namely that efficiency can be about consumer welfare or total welfare. And then we start mapping legal systems around these terms with this methodology. And on the basis of the information that I have, it is also pretty plausible that much of EU sector-specific legislation also operates on the basis of the same principles. And this makes perfect sense because consumer law is on a spectrum with antitrust law. They have very different notions of consumers. In antitrust law, the national healthcare system is a consumer. Whereas in consumer law, of course, you have the tiny, mini notion of consumer as the natural person and so on. So if you find that the same normative principles operate in one context and in the other, then the difference is going to be mostly about the institutional framework, which suggests that also in sector-specific legislation, when again, it is the institutional context that changes, the market structure and so on, you will find the same normative principles. And then there are very interesting conceptual questions. So how does consumer welfare relate to financial stability, for example? How does consumer welfare relate with security of supply in food law or security of supply in energy law? To be honest, I think it is not rocket science to understand that if you do not have food, consumers are not happy, right? So probably it is possible to connect rather straightforwardly the idea of security of supply to the idea of consumer welfare in long-term contracts, right? Because if contracts are planning devices and people need to be able to rely on them, stability is part of the important features that constitute consumer welfare from a legal point of view. So this is the kind of analysis that I think we need to do more. Criminal law, for example, is an area where the market bypassing theory of Posner is actually quite friendly to this whole discussion that I did. And then there is, for people who are more inclined into normative debates, there is also the question of why is it the case that we would want to accept that the market is about consumer welfare and not total welfare? Well, the baseline is you have hated total welfare for so long that it might make sense to consider consumer welfare a little bit as an idea. But recently, I have been working in these two papers.
Ya estamos pasados de tiempo, pero bueno, para que...
Estoy terminando.
Sí, perfecto, gracias.
And I think that, and so in these two papers, I've been developing the idea of the norm of equality that supports consumer welfare. There is a strong element of reciprocity. When I cook the people for whom I cook are entitled to a certain treatment, just like when the people for whom I'm cooking are entitled owe a certain treatment to their clients, and then these other clients when they become producers, and so on and so forth. So there is a notion of indirect reciprocity that is compatible with this idea of consumer welfare. So this is essentially what I've been investigating in this paper, and in this other paper, I'm working on a game theory justification for consumer welfare, because there is this idea of essentially this idea of looking at two markets in related to each other creates the possibility of a prisoner dilemma. So if I cheat you, then you also cheat me, then everybody behaves as a monopolist, everybody loses. And there is a literature in this area that shows that the best way to solve this prisoner dilemma is to delegate the control over your action to the other party under condition of reciprocity. And what do you get if you do that? Consumer welfare. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Fabricio, por la presentación. Si quieres, cierra el PowerPoint, así nos vemos las caras más grandes. Ahí está, perfecto. Bueno, preguntas. Abrimos el debate. Edgar, por favor.
Gracias, Diego.
Perdona,
¿se escucha?
Sí, se escucha perfecto. Digo
¿Sí?
que levanten la mano los demás, que veo que mueven la mano, así los apunto por orden. Gracias, Edgar. Sí, tu pregunta, sí, tranquilo.
Muchas gracias, Diego. Thank you very much, Fabrizio, for your very interesting presentation. I just have a couple of things to say, and one of which is the following. You, of course, I'm with you with all you said about the need for conceptual analysis and the role of legal theorists in the sense of making sense of much of the talk and thought in different domains, which is not to say that we're very important people or whatever, or that we develop a very important function, but just maybe an interesting one. Well, you used the notion of sovereignty as attached to the consumer. And I was wondering if you were really committed, or to what sense of sovereignty are you committed? Because in a sense, the sovereignty could be analyzed in terms of the one who's being sovereign has no duty to anyone else but himself or herself. And in a certain point of your talk, you were willing to say that consumers have certain duties with regards to producers or providers. And I mean, I'm guessing that you are using the term sovereign or sovereignty in a certain relaxed way, or at least in an opaque way, which is not very clearly stated. And it is a little bit weird to call someone or something sovereign when it also has certain duties to the other party. Well, that's a very maybe even naive observation. The other one has to do with the way you related the legal theorist or the theorist with the legal reasoning, or with legal reasoning. It was kind of what is the enterprise you are pursuing? Is it to justify certain portions of the law? Because maybe, I mean, when you want to do that, and you are kind of presenting your methodology as a kind of neutral, explanatory enterprise, but I think that some internal values or maybe value commitments are past underlying the table, or so to speak, because maybe when you think of bringing coherence to a certain segment or portion of legislation or court decisions, maybe this explanatory on the surface enterprise ends up being kind of an evaluative one, because maybe the analyst is kind of committed to his or her own value commitments and framing them in this vocabulary of making sense of certain portions of legislation or of court decisions. And maybe it is not as neutral as you want to present it. That's well my second observation. Thank you very much.
Okay. Shall I? So first of all, I'm not a specialist in the political and debates on the notion of sovereignty, but my intuition is that a notion of sovereign in real world institutions that does not owe duties to its constituents is indefensible. It is one of the sorry consequences of Hart being a bit dismissive of the people that he was actually portraying, that we associate with idea with Austin, because when I studied Austin on this matter carefully, this was not really his position. So we can say the core of the notion of sovereignty is that you get to tell other people what to do. Yes, just like the core of the notion of property is that you get to tell other people what to do. But this, just like an owner has duties towards others, I believe that a sovereign has duties towards others. So this is my it is not philosophically developed, but I think it is defensible. And this is, I admit that this is an area where I would love to learn from people who know more about this. There are many parts of this project that can be developed further, and this is definitely one of those. When it comes to the justification part, I think that the main risk that I have is of distorting the materials to make them fit in the analytical framework. Okay, especially when I started working on this project. Now my views are more elaborated on the normative level, but as I really, it was not really not about whether it is justified or not. It was really about we will not get to ask whether it is justified or not if we don't understand what is really going on, right? And the instrumentalization critique, I think, is a beautiful example of how far away from looking at what it is for what it is we can go. So that is my view. This being said, I believe that it is defensible. But this does not mean that I can tell you whether the actual legal structures that we have are the best. This is not my job. I do not know whether for a certain problem the consumers need empowerment or it needs protection, right? I lack a methodology for that, but I can tell you that the legislator or the court is committed to the idea that by doing that, by enlarging the use of information duties or restricting the use of information duties in a certain context, they are trying to deliver for the consumer, which means that then I can team up with somebody who has the methodology that is lacking to me, and I can help frame their argument in an argument that the court has to accept, right? Because it builds on the same commitments that the court has, right? So the court, suppose, enlarge the information duties to make consumers better off. I can show behavioral sciences, which is one of the areas that influence me the most, shows that oftentimes they are not enough. Now I have a reason for empirically justified, informed reason to demand for legislative reform. This is everything that I have.
Gracias. Henry, por favor.
Thank you, Fabrizio, for your exposition. I have two questions. The first one is in an explanatory way. If we think of your methodology in this way, you're speaking about ideas that lawyers and judges already have, or that they will recognize after careful thinking. Why, if this is the case, why this one is better than, for example, ideas of corrective justice that seems that explain better concepts like causality, damage, guilt, etc. in private law. This one is the first one. And the second one is, if we think of this methodology in a justification way, how other kinds of reasons come into play. For example, which consumers are you thinking of? All of them? Some of them? A particular class? Because maybe wealth and poverty might have a bearing on the standard that we are willing to set. That's all. Thank you so much.
So thank you very much. With regard to the second point, if we bite to the bullet the idea that if we bite the bullet and it's about consumer welfare, then we need to specify with something that I do not need for the purpose of this book. What is the theory of welfare that we have? And I think as a lawyer, I would apply, if you were to give me the grant to build up the team to do that, I would try to reverse engineer in the same way, but on the basis of different theoretical disagreements, the theory of obligation that we have in our legal systems, right? Because there is where you see in action a notion of welfare, right? And then the claim would be that, yes, it makes sense to, most probably, it makes sense to pay more attention to the most vulnerable. Why? Because they are the ones that are less sovereign by themselves. So they are the ones who are more in need of an agent who acts on their behalf. And with regard to the first question, I fear that you are assuming that corrective justice is different from an efficiency explanation. And so I think that you are walking on the thin line that might very easily lead you into reification. So I would need to analyze your theory of corrective justice related from a pragmatic point of view with my understanding of consumer welfare to see where we really disagree. Because if we don't, it is just a matter of language. And then the task should be to be able to express the same claim in corrective justice terms and in consumer welfare terms.
Gracias. Alex?
Thank you, Fabrizio, for your presentation. I only have two questions. The first one is about how do you differentiate who is consumer and who is not? Because, of course, that your presentation is built on the base that there is something like consumer welfare and something that is total welfare. Yes, but what is the criteria that you use to differentiate that? Because in one part of your exposition you say something like workers are consumers of another market, but you can say that of all the groups that integrates the society. So what is that criteria? And the second question is about if you say that in the end, both explanations, both approaches to economics and markets are grounded on the basis of equality or reciprocity, that concept of equality or a kind of equality or reciprocity. Why don't make your thesis, I don't know, your explanation in more sincere terms and talk about reciprocity and equality directly, and why to speak about welfare? No, is that
okay? So thank you very much. The answer to the second question is the same that I gave to Henry. Essentially, I am capable of formulating the argument in both languages because these are just languages; they're not concepts, right? So I can formulate the argument in terms of equality in the sense of reciprocity if I talk about consumer welfare, and I can formulate the argument in terms of neutrality of the state if I want to talk about total welfare. So it really depends which audience I am dealing with. That's the answer to the second question. The answer to the first question, so who is a consumer? you are right, for the total welfare standard, actually, that is the Bork move that in Europe some people call the Chicago trap, saying that, yeah, everyone is a consumer in some other markets, so it is when they say consumer welfare, they actually mean total welfare. No, they don't, because in a contractual, in the market for bananas, I am selling the bananas and you are buying the bananas, right? So you are the consumer and I am the producer or the trader. In the market for electricity, if you are selling electricity and I am buying electricity, it is clear who the consumer is. So doctrinal analysis of the contracts that are used in order to perform these exchanges helps you identifying straightforwardly who the consumer is and who the producer is. Black letter law analysis.
I don't know if I could make a reply, but you have in society a chain of contracts.
Yeah.
Who's selling bananas have another contract with the provider or with the farmer who produces his bananas on his land. So I think that in one point you have to choose which contract do you mean. Do you want to focus the importance of your speech? And when you do that, of course, that you are drawing a line that is in one sense arbitrary. I don't know how to that it depends only that on the academic who is making his explanation. It is not an argument of that you can say, oh, only these kind of contracts are important to me. What is the argument to say that only that contract is important? Because there are another contracts that are related with the contract that you carried.
Okay, so let's stick with bananas. In United Brands, there was a dominant firm who entered into exclusionary practices and exploitative practices with its competitors and its distributors, right? So he wronged them, okay? So, and the distributors of bananas who are buying the bananas, so they own the bananas, then they bear the risk that no one will want to buy the bananas. They get to set the prices of the bananas down the market. They are, in the broader non-consumer law sense, they are the consumers of banana, right? They are the intermediate consumers of bananas in more technical terms. When they get to go on the market and they sell the bananas to final consumers, they have now become the producers. So just like they were entitled to certain legal protections, right? There were some normative principles that were animating the relationship up the chain. There are now the same principles that animate the relationship down the chain. And actually, one of the things that we see is that the law is willing to pierce the chain upward, right? So the manufacturer has a directive tort law liability towards the consumer, right? And that makes perfect efficiency sense, right? So I don't think that these are arbitrary distinctions. These are doctrinal distinctions, right? There is one contract, and then there is another contract, and then there is another contract, right? So these are institutional facts. Whether you like them or not, they exist. So no, why not? Why not? Why? So my just was another thing. In my one of the things that I'm working on right now is the notion of the causa, right? And I think there is a lot of confusion when it comes to the socioeconomic function of the contracts. And I would, maybe if you invite me in 2 years' time, I will tell you more in detail, but I think essentially that there are two types of contracts. The first is the exchange, and the second is the organizational contract, right? So the exchange contract is about consumer welfare. The organizational contracts, I'm not sure yet what it's about. So a labor contract is a completely different thing from an exchange contract, right? A service contract is animated by these principles, but a labor contract is not. On top of all of these, we can say, oh, the farmers are fundamentally being exploited by the Monsanto, right? And then we have a different kind of problem, you may say, because it's not a problem of consumer welfare, right? Because Monsanto is benefiting from this. I think that we need a normative theory about the basic entitlements that market participants have to make sure that producers are not being exploited. But provided that those entitlements are vindicated, everything else is about consumer welfare.
Sí. Esteban, no sé si tenías antes una pregunta y te arrepentiste o...
No era por levantarla, para no tenerla levantada.
Eso, vale.
Sí. Gracias, Fabricio. Dos preguntas. La primera, ¿crees posible, desde tu punto de vista, construir una filosofía del derecho de consumo? Esto me parece que es un desafío importante y que creo que está presente en tu trabajo. Si te parece que es posible, ¿cómo sería una teoría o una filosofía del derecho del consumidor general o local, parroquiana, como la indicabas tú en tu presentación? Y la segunda pregunta es, ¿cuál es tu opinión respecto de la discusión acerca de los fundamentos filosóficos del derecho, en este caso del análisis económico del derecho? La discusión respecto de Posner con la doctrina utilitarista, la crítica de Dworkin, porque creo que el recurso al law and economics, en el caso del derecho del consumidor, es un recurso importante, interesante, pero debiere el análisis económico del derecho contar con una fundamentación filosófica. Y no estoy del todo seguro si en la propia literatura del Law and Economics hay un acuerdo respecto de eso. ¿Y cuál sería la doctrina? La utilidad, maximización de la riqueza, welfare, es decir, hay una serie de posibilidades. Me gustaría saber tu punto de vista. Muchas gracias y felicidades, Mauricio.
Primeiro, eu adorei a expressão filosofia do direito do consumidor. Eu nunca tenha pensado isso nesses termos. General or parochial? It depends on the methodological assumptions that you're building to build upon, right? So far, my approach is as much as possible, but Edgar, of course, has is policing me on that, is to be descriptive, right? So I need to be necessarily parochial, because if I'm not describing something in detail, I'm not talking about anything. Then there can be a level of generalization and so on and so forth. That's a direction, I think, for a comparative law and economics approach. That is the direction where I would need to move, because I am very, very skeptical of descriptive universal theories, because you are claiming that on the base, they are very inductive, because you claim that on the basis of a limited assumption number of observations, you are describing everything that has ever been and will ever be. I mean, I think we can in our limitedness we can work with parochial, but I see that Diego is suffering when I'm saying these things. But the minute in which we switch from the descriptive to the interpretive or the normative, then the situation completely changes. And I think I'm not capable of going there yet, but one of the aspirations is going there. And this connects with your second point. The reason why I got interested in the idea of efficiency as consumer welfare is because if in this, one of the things that I was most frustrated by the normative debate that you mentioned is that it is not even capable of accounting for the basic distinction between distribution and redistribution. Everything is the same. The welfare that the value that we share in the contract is the same as the value that we share in society. It was not like that, for example, in Caplo and Chauvel 1994, but it became like that in Caplo and Chauvel 2001. Right? They made that move. Economists in their textbooks had made that move before, right? When they say, I am neutral because distribution between the parties, I cannot really tell you. They had already made that move. It took some time for the move to be made in the same with the same strength in law and economics. And I think that at the very least, I reclaim for this debate a sharp distinction between distribution and redistribution, because distribution is now incorporated in the notion of market efficiency. Right? A market that harms the consumers is commutative justice, is problematic in terms of commutative justice in the relationship, and it's also problematic in efficiency terms. So, and again, the big challenge is resisting the temptation of reification. I think the best way that I have to make a contribution at these normative debates is by showing, oh, here you have a reification, I can rid of it, and once I get rid of it, this is the next step that we're capable of doing. Just like I hope I did persuasively with instrumentalization. This is what you're assuming, and this is what you get. On the basis of those assumptions, it makes perfect sense. But here is a different assumption, and with different assumptions, the word institutional reality looks legitimate on its own terms, right? So that is the challenge.
¿Hay alguna otra pregunta más? Si no, yo tengo las mías, pero Henry.
Something that you say raised a question in me is, for example, where you're speaking of distribution or redistribution, or if you say contract law, I say derecho contractual, or we say something in a different language. How we can speak about these different things with different terms if we don't share a concept? While you are skeptic about description in this way, in this universal way, because for me, you are able to describe, for example, the concept of law here in general, and this is a descriptive argument.
But this is an assumption that many people do not share, right? So this is a point where you need, for example, in comparative law, this is a very tricky move to say, oh, here is a set of things that everyone has, and then you go in some African community and they do not have those features, so they don't have law, right? So
why not?
Because if you have a definition and that is the universal definition of law, and that definition doesn't apply to what they have there, then they don't have law according to your syllogism, and it's not mine, right? But the step back, the anxiety with regard to translation, right? We switch from natural languages to other natural languages all the time. We have a whole literature on constitutive rules. So the idea of why, when we move to the most exalted terms that we use in our professional life, we are worried about exploring the opportunity of translations. They do not need to be complete translations, right? So, for example, in Italian, it is very difficult to say that marriage is a contract. Why? Because we have put a lot of emphasis on the patrimonial dimension of the agreement. And then people resist the idea that you are vindicating the richness and the complexity of marriage if you say it's a contract, because you are overemphasizing the syllogistic or the commodity dimension thereof. But in Portugal, they're completely comfortable with the idea because they have civil contracts and commercial contracts. And then they are more comfortable with the idea that marriage is a contract, right? So we can speak to each other without sharing exactly the same conception, but just by being clear about where they match and where they don't. But we need to ask these questions more often, I think.
Edgar, sí.
Gracias, Diego. Fabrizio, I would like to keep pressing you on the point between the divide between descriptive and prescriptive, but in this second chance, would I be right in describing your project as a kind of a reductionist analysis in the sense that you are trying to make what is maybe multi-purposive translated into one purpose model in the sense of consumers' welfare? But because if that is the case, I don't think that a reductionist analysis succeeds in this instance, because you would have to provide us with some sort of success criteria if you are in fact performing a reductive analysis. And because think of it in this way, what if we have incoherent law or incoherent policies? If you are really in the descriptive channel, sort of saying, you would have to come to the conclusion that, well, yeah, we have incoherent, for instance, legislation. Say maybe the legislator thinks of consumer law as being multi-purposive in the sense that it doesn't just look for consumer welfare, but also reciprocity or whatever other end. So if I understood you correctly, that would be, my question is, how would we deal with those kinds of things? The voice of the legislator, what if we have incoherent law in that sense, in the sense of them, the legislators, thinking of this realm of the law as being multi-purposive? Because it seems like performing this reductive analysis to some extent means to reduce or lower the voice of the legislators. We do that every day by way of interpreting the law in a certain sense. But I'm so yeah. Is it reductive? And what happens with if you are descriptive also with this kind of multi-purposive language, at least in a superficial way that the legislators use? Thank you.
So I would unpack two different. So Edgar, thank you for the challenge. I would like to unpack two different things. One is the languages, the incoherent languages, and the other one is the conflicting goals. Okay, so I think with the languages, I'm not very concerned because oftentimes it is a matter of see to what extent this is just exactly a matter of language and not a matter of concepts, right? But the other point is better, right? So it's way more challenging. And in this regard, I'm not reductionist. I hope, at least the commitment is, I don't want to give a full account of everything that is happening in EU antitrust and EU consumer law. I just think that we get one step closer to the truth if we remove the association of total welfare with efficiency. That's why, if you remember in the second slide, I said better understood as meant to allocate resources efficiently, right? It's not best, it's not better understood as meant only to allocate resources efficiently, so that when we have, as we do sometimes in consumption law, right, we have duties toward the environment. And these duties justify de facto for the legislator, and potentially also from a theoretical point of view, they justifying sticking it to the consumer. So the first task is identifying where this happens and describing how it happens. And most of the times, this has to do with proportionality analysis, right? And proportionality analysis is beautifully economic in its structure, right? But it is not economic in the utilitaristic sense of the more of a unit that is clear. Proportionality analysis reminds of social welfare functions. And then there are so many different versions of social welfare functions. If I have raised concerns on these matters, or if you already had concerns of this matter and you did not come across the book, the last book by Matthew Adler in a very accessible language translates all the main moral positions, utilitarian, sufficientism, prioritarianism, in social welfare function terms, right? And that is the gold standard, right? For the capacity, you cannot claim that it is efficiency versus, it is moral concepts versus economic concepts. If you can take the main moral positions about distributive justice and translate them into an equation. So I think so for me, the next question would be, if I were to deal with that, is to do the same task, but to understand which kind of social welfare function better matches the legal structures that we have, to then see if when the legislator intervenes in consumer relations for other purposes, whether that is defensible in proportionality terms or social welfare function terms, but from the perspective of the social welfare function that makes sense for that community. Make sense?
¿Algo más? Bueno, voy con mis preguntas. Gracias, Fabricio, por la presentación, muy interesante. Hay varias cosas que me interesaron, pero voy a seleccionar un par nada más. Las dos primeras son preguntas simplemente de comprensión. Como no he leído el libro todavía, no lo tengo claro, pero ¿tú crees que puede existir una divergencia entre la riqueza total o el bienestar total y el bienestar del consumidor en mercados competitivos, en mercados perfectamente competitivos? ¿O es solo algo que tiene que ver con los monopolios, ¿sí? O esquemas donde, por ejemplo, se puedan llegar a discriminar precios, que es discutible, muy discutible que sea un mercado competitivo, si es posible fácticamente hacer la discriminación de precios, ¿no?
It is not. At least the theory that the way I understand it is not.
No es posible esa divergencia.
No es posible.
Y ahora, entonces, cuando vas a la situaciones monopólicas donde se puede discriminar precios, la gran pregunta que surge es, bueno, ¿qué criterio vamos a tomar? ¿La eficiencia global o el bienestar del consumidor? Si tomamos bienestar del consumidor, esto es contrario a las normas, a las prácticas de discriminación de precios y por lo tanto debemos prohibirlas, ¿sí? Pero este es un alegato bien fuerte y evidente, digamos, no requiere tanta tarea interpretativa, ¿me entiendes? Digo, ni hacer interpretaciones constructivas, ni demasiado análisis conceptual, porque la norma es bastante clara ahí. Y, sin embargo, la literatura económica discute si el concepto de eficiencia es, digamos, saben los economistas que hay prohibición de discriminar precios, y aún así están discutiendo si lo que importa es el total o el bienestar del consumidor, ¿no? Hay una discusión bastante importante. Hace 20 años yo dejé de leerla, pero en su momento la leí entre las visiones europeas, las visiones en Estados Unidos. Discuten los teóricos sobre qué es lo que debe primar, pero ninguno ignora que la normativa prohíbe discriminar precios. Entonces, claro, parece una evidencia muy contundente a favor de tu tesis, pero a la vez que mucha parte de la literatura no le parece que es definitivo eso. Entonces, ¿cuál es la explicación? ¿Encuentran otra justificación para la discriminación de precios que no tiene que ver con que el verdadero concepto de eficiencia es el bienestar del consumidor? ¿O qué? ¿Qué es lo que pasa aquí? Sí, esto es una primera... No sé si quieres ir contestando.
Não, eu quero, porque são muitas coisas, né? Então,
English if you prefer. I prefer
no. So on the first point, as a matter of consequences, it would not make a difference, right? But in the very narrow sense that the outcome would be the outcome that we want, right? So, but and it makes perfect sense to connect this, I think, with Adam Smith. So Adam Smith has these very strong statements in favor of consumer welfare, but he's also an enthusiastic defender of the idea of the invisible hand. Why? Because perfect competition is going to solve the normative problem of making sure that even the sociopath, right, even the guy from Wall Street, I don't remember the name of, would work in the interest of consumers. Right, so he could be motivated by greed, right, and still the unintended consequences of his behavior would be consumer welfare maximization. Then we could say he thinks that the moral justification is total welfare. That's his problem. It is not our institutional problem, because the institution makes sure that the outcome is what we want, if that's what we want. But we will need also in this society a statement about what we want in order to take position one in one direction or the other, right? Now, with regard to the second point, I think that if you read, I think it's really tricky, but my view on the matter is the following. Our main enemy is complexity. And this has been now clear to me because of the unlawful invasion of Ukraine by the Russian state. Because I have seen every day in very smart people how the seed of complexity pollutes the capacity of reasoning of people. And this was not so clear to me before. And mark my words, right now, what is happening with antitrust law in the US is that for good reasons, the consumer welfare standard is being attacked. Also because sometimes it is not about consumers. Mergers are not only about consumers, right? But what is going to happen is that if they manage to tear down the house, the social group that is going to be better organized to rebuild the house to their advantage is the same social group that managed to destroy Raw. Okay, it took them 40 years, but they succeeded. And Bork's book, I don't remember the exact year, but it's not that younger than Raw. Okay, so if they tear down the house and they build something else, it's going to go to the Supreme Court one way or on the other. And what do you think the Supreme Court is going to cite? It's going to cite Posner on monopolies, on natural monopolies, and it is going to cite Bork, and it is going to be about total welfare. So one of the things that it is really important that people start doing is being very careful about the words that are being used. Okay, I do not have vast knowledge in terms of literature, but there is this poem that I cite at the beginning of the book from Brecht, and the core passage to me is the enemy distorted our words so that we cannot recognize them anymore. Okay, now completely the level of drama there is completely different, but is the mechanism so different? I invite you to read the well-meaning on its face book by Sunstein and Bargill, so the top of American academia, on price personalization, to see how much difficulty they have to vindicate the moral intuition that there is something fundamentally wrong that is happening there, right? We have the terminology for saying that there is a wrong. They are exploiting the consumers. I am a Ghostbuster fan. I am a very big Ghostbuster fan. I don't understand why the producer or YouTube or whoever should be entitled to charge me €2 more than to Edgar or to Diego, that sadly for them are not such big fans of Ghostbusters, right? It is one of the things that makes me, and that I should be entitled to enjoy it, because it's about me. It is not about them. They want to get more money from me. They can make extra content. They can make merchandising. There are so many ways in which somebody can extract value through fair transactions from people. And it is really important that we make sure that people actually focus on that. So the Ghostbuster example is also on the record.
No, sigo teniendo alguna duda porque ahora en tu respuesta me surge otra duda que no tenía originalmente, pero no la menciono rápidamente, pues son muchas cosas, pero respecto de tu respuesta diría, mira, el argumento a favor de la eficiencia desde el punto de vista interno, la práctica, es muy fuerte en contratos y en defensa del consumidor, ¿no? Ahora estás presentando una visión que tiene más que ver con wronging the consumer, ¿no? Y esto no estoy seguro.
Just a clarification. Is your assumption that this traditional total welfare justification of contracts is a good one? Is intuitively a good one? This is your premise?
Much better than what it does in tort law theory.
Yeah, but still, what is the threshold for failing an exam in Spain?
For failing what? An exam?
For failing an exam.
Yes, it fails. Sí, suspende. Todavía suspende. ¿Crees tú?
No, what is the grade? What is the grade for failing?
Cinco.
So if in torts they get 2 and in contracts they get 3.
No, en contracts está más cerca. En contratos yo creo que hay bastante que aprender en términos de eficiencia, ¿no? De total welfare. Bastante.
But for example, it is true, but because actually in contracts there is a very interesting move. It is not about total welfare per se, but it's about Pareto improvements. And then you can say, yeah, well, the Pareto improvement ex ante, what part,
claro,
the way
no
with,
problemático pero
right,
bueno,
right.
En todo caso creo que presenta una batalla mucho más interesante el punto de vista de la eficiencia, ¿no? Contra otras, ¿no? Otras ideas basadas en el daño en sí mismo, ¿no? O el wrong. Pero
I think Harry disagrees with that.
Me interesan esto, pero es que no vamos a acabar nunca, nos queda muy poco tiempo, así que ya lo dejamos para otro día, el resto del debate. Me interesa también los casos de empate, que están muy relacionados con esto, ¿no? Donde los principios pueden explicar los resultados y tú dices, bueno, pero prestemos atención a las palabras, esto es una cuestión descriptiva, conceptual, y luego como cuestión de política dices, y usemos las palabras correctas para que no queden dudas, ¿no? Ahí son dos ideas diferentes. Pero yo no estoy seguro de que las palabras que usan muestran realmente que esa sea la justificación, ¿no? Hay toda una tradición, hay un paper muy interesante de Jody Krauss que muestra que hay una convergencia que es contextual entre cierto lenguaje deóntico y el razonamiento consecuencialista. Es más fácilmente vendible como justificación, pero eso no significa que sea realmente lo que justifica las decisiones, ¿no? Entonces también esto me parece que es algo muy interesante que tú dices, porque yo tiendo a estar más de acuerdo que en desacuerdo, pero tampoco me parece del todo concluyente. No creo que uno pueda terminar de explicar los casos y decir, bueno, aquí los dos principios se explican, pero como se usa cierto lenguaje, voy a asumir que es el bienestar del consumidor. No alcanza, creo. Creo que hay que encontrar inconsistencias, y la mayor inconsistencia es discriminación de precios. Por eso digo, ese es un ejemplo muy prominente, ¿no?
Sorry, Diego, but maybe it's because Spanish is still difficult to follow for me, but I don't. The point is not to describe with the same words, because then you're not describing, you are repeating.
No,
but
but
the point is to describe with a different terms without distorting the concept.
No, but you are taking at face value what they say.
No. But for me, the justification. But this is
the justification. And
for me, the justification is what they write, not what they think.
What they write, not what they think. Well,
right. So I'm not in the business of reading judge's mind. I am in the business of reading what they say and using that to explain to my students, just like somebody else would use that to explain to their clients.
But you wouldn't say.
I know, but
I mean, but the ruling is what is written, or the principle behind all those decisions is what is written. It depends what is being decided and in which way. Now you have a draw between those principles. You have
but just to clarify, you do not have a draw. So what you have but in my data set, what you have is situations where the reasoning of the court is so superficial that you cannot adjudicate between the two. But in the same data set, there are other decisions that swing one way. So your data set is a data set that is partially superficial and partially swings one way. So that way, you get the situation where the consumer welfare standard, suppose, describes describes 8 cases. The cases with the camera on, there is more light in those cases, right? The 5 cases with the camera on, but also describes the other 3 less well. You have the other theoretical position. It describes only those 3 cases, and it doesn't describe these 5. How can you say that the second is in caso di empate? It's not in caso di empate. It's losing big time. 8-3, right? The delta is 5. Under these in this context. Now the delta is 4. But it is unless you provide me a theoretical argument, and I reflected and they couldn't find it, a theoretical argument that says the cases that are shallower are theoretically as meaningful as, or even more meaningful than, the cases where the court did not need to, but decided to go deeper in its reasoning. Because, for example, the Servizio Elettrico Nazionale is the case where last year the Court of Justice said, as clearly as possible, it is about consumer welfare and antitrust. Okay, while in the US there was the chaos that you had, right? This is not insignificant that in this historical moment, in a line of cases where the same thing had been told, but not as explicit, the court decides to state it as with this level of clarity. And I think that these are the situations, increasing the degree of transparency of the reasoning or theorization of the reasoning is meaningful. And so when you deal with multiple cases on the same issue, the more theorized ones matter more.
No, I'm sympathetic to the view, where I have written is on those lines also. I mean, but sometimes I don't find it. It depends on the whole bunch of data you have. For example, do you include the price discrimination cases or you exclude them? Because the price discrimination cases are the clear cases. I'm talking about the rest of the cases in which both explanation might. But I see your point. No problem.
The more
time and people has to leave, so I would prefer to do one last question. I have several. We can discuss another time between the two of us. I was curious about the new handbook you are editing about the algorithms for fixing prices. Mm-hmm. Do you think those are compatible with competitive markets or not? Which is your
I think the answer is in the question. Fixing prices is prohibited.
Deciding, not fixing. That's why I prefer to use Spanish. I'm not as precise.
Yeah.
Not fixing prices. I mean, deciding which is going to be the price in each transaction.
So this is a really complicated question. Of course, when we are dealing with we deal with something that is unfamiliar, especially when it comes to the market, we think the worst and we want to, and the first reaction is let's prohibit it one way or the other. It might be the final conclusion that we get, but before, so for example, when I looked into price personalization, my first reaction was we need to find a way to stop this one way or another. Now I have a more complex understanding of, it's more nuanced. In some situations we need to stop it, but how do we stop it? So I don't see why there is something fundamentally wrong in the price being fixed by the algorithm, right? Being set is the word that you're looking for in English, right? Being set by the algorithm. It might even be the case that we bite the bullet and we say, you know, algorithms now are so good at setting prices that why don't we, you know what, we're going to ask the central bank as part of its monetary policy to set prices. Companies are going to focus on cost minimization, right? They innovate and they make money because the price for bananas is 5. If you can produce it for 3, you make 2. If you can produce them for 4, you make 1. If you can produce them for 6, you lose money. We may even move, at some point, the technological granularity may even imply that it makes sense to take some entitlements out of the market and put it into legislation. I'm not suggesting that this is going to happen anytime soon, but it is part of the variables that, just like price, let's put it this way, just like price personalization was a theoretical thing into Pigue's book for many years, and now it's not. The socialist calculus debate was a dream that then turned into a not so well functioning reality, but maybe with algorithms we could do without the market. I don't know, in the sense in which we know them right now.
Ok, bueno, muchas gracias, Fabrizio, muchas gracias por el seminario, por el debate. Eres un discutidor incansable como siempre, así que nada, creo que
Now I need a break. Yes, now I do.
You deserve it.
Thank you everyone for giving me such a wonderful time, and please reach out to me for whatever, if you want to continue, and I'm constantly looking for people who might have the skills and the will to develop this in one direction or the other.
Estupendo, muchas gracias.
Henry, corrective justice, I'm looking at you. Edgar, the social welfare function and other values thing, I am looking at you. Alexander, I think we would need to fight a little bit more.
Great. Thank you for your presentation.
Lo dejamos aquí y será.
And I am also looking for book reviewers, Alexander, for example. You see?
Gracias.
Lo dejamos aquí hasta la próxima sesión de
Muchas gracias a todos. Gracias, Fabrizio.
Muchas gracias.
Chao, chao.
Gracias, chicos. Nos vemos.